How and how long afterward I reached the place I cannot say, but Richard Benning was already there, kneeling beside the dreadful thing that had been woman. "She is dead, quite dead," he said coldly. "I will go to town for assistance. Please do me the favor to remain." He rose to his feet and moved away, but in a moment had stopped and turned about. "You have doubtless observed, my friend," he said, "that this was entirely her own act. I did not rise in time to prevent it, and you, not knowing her mental condition, you could not, of course, have suspected." His manner maddened me. "You are as much her assassin," I said, "as if your damnable hands had cut her throat." He shrugged his shoulders without reply and, turning, walked away. A moment later I heard, through the deepening shadows of the wood into which he had disappeared, a rich, strong, baritone voice singing, "La Donna e Mobile," from Rigoletto. The damned thing, one does not always eat what is on the table. By the light of a tallow candle which had been placed on one end of a rough table, a man was reading something written in a book. It was an old account book, greatly worn, and the writing was not, apparently, very legible, for the man sometimes held the page close to the flame of the candle to get a stronger light on it. The shadow of the book would then throw into obscurity a half of the room, darkening a number of faces and figures, for besides the reader, 8 other men were present. 7 of them sat against the rough log walls, silent, motionless, and the room being small, not very far from the table. By extending an arm any one of them could have touched the 8th man, who lay on the table, face upward, partly covered by a sheet, his arms at his sides. He was dead. The man with the book was not reading aloud, and no one spoke. All seemed to be waiting for something to occur. The dead man only was without expectation. From the blank darkness outside came in, through the aperture that served for a window, all the ever unfamiliar noises of night in the wilderness, the long nameless note of a distant coyote, the stilly pulsing thrill of tireless insects in trees, strange cries of night birds, so different from those of the birds of day, the drone of great blundering beetles, and all that mysterious chorus of small sounds that seem always to have been but half heard when they have suddenly ceased, as if conscious of an indiscretion. But nothing of all this was noted in that company. Its members were not overmuch addicted to idle interest in matters of no practical importance. That was obvious in every line of their rugged faces, obvious even in the dim light of the single candle. They were evidently men of the vicinity, farmers and woodsmen. The person reading was a trifle different. One would have said of him that he was of the world, worldly, albeit there was that in his attire which attested a certain fellowship with the organisms of his environment. His coat would hardly have passed muster in San Francisco, his footgear was not of urban origin, and the hat that lay by him on the floor, he was the only one uncovered, was such that if one had considered it as an article of mere personal adornment he would have missed its meaning. In countenance the man was rather prepossessing, with just a hint of sternness, though that he may have assumed or cultivated, as appropriate to one in authority. For he was a coroner. It was by virtue of his office that he had possession of the book in which he was reading. It had been found among the dead man's effects in his cabin, where the inquest was now taking place. When the coroner had finished reading, he put the book into his breast pocket. At that moment the door was pushed open and a young man entered. He, clearly, was not of mountain birth and breeding. He was clad as those who dwell in cities. His clothing was dusty, however, as from travel. He had, in fact, been riding hard to attend the inquest. The coroner nodded. No one else greeted him. "We have waited for you," said the coroner. "It is necessary to have done with this business tonight." The young man smiled. "I am sorry to have kept you," he said. "I went away, not to evade your summons, but to post to my newspaper an account of what I suppose I am called back to relate." The coroner smiled. "The account that you posted to your newspaper," he said, "differs, probably, from that which you will give here under oath." "That," replied the other, rather hotly and with a visible flush, "is as you please. I used manifold paper and have a copy of what I sent. It was not written as news, for it is incredible, but as fiction. It may go as a part of my testimony under oath. But you say it is incredible. That is nothing to you, sir, if I also swear that it is true." The coroner was silent for a time, his eyes upon the floor. The men about the sides of the cabin talked in whispers, but seldom withdrew their gaze from the face of the corpse. Presently the coroner lifted his eyes and said, "We will resume the inquest. The men removed their hats. The witness was sworn. "What is your name?" the coroner asked. "William Harker. Age 27. You knew the deceased, Hugh Morgan?" "Yes." "You were with him when he died?" "Near him." "How did that happen? Your presence, I mean." "I was visiting him at this place to shoot and fish." A part of my purpose, however, was to study him and his odd, solitary way of life. He seemed a good model for a character in fiction. "I sometimes write stories. I sometimes read them." "Thank you. Stories in general, not yours." Some of the jurors laughed. Against a somber background, humor shows highlights. Soldiers in the intervals of battle laugh easily, and a jest in the death chamber conquers by surprise. "Relate the circumstances of this man's death," said the coroner. "You may use any notes or memoranda that you please." The witness understood. Pulling a manuscript from his breast pocket, he held it near the candle and turning the leaves until he found the passage that he wanted, began to read. "To what may happen in a field of wild oats. The sun had hardly risen when we left the house. We were looking for quail, each with a shotgun, but we had only one dog. Morgan said that our best ground was beyond a certain ridge that he pointed out, and we crossed it by a trail through the chaparral. On the other side was comparatively level ground, thickly covered with wild oats. As we emerged from the chaparral, Morgan was but a few yards in advance. Suddenly we heard, at a little distance to our right and partly in front, a noise as of some animal thrashing about in the bushes, which we could see were violently agitated. "We've started a deer," I said. "I wish we had brought a rifle." Morgan, who had stopped and was intently watching the agitated chaparral, said nothing, but had cocked both barrels of his gun and was holding it in readiness to aim. I thought him a trifle excited, which surprised me, for he had a reputation for exceptional coolness, even in moments of sudden and imminent peril. "Oh, come," I said. "You are not going to fill up a deer with quail shot, are you?" Still he did not reply, but catching a sight of his face as he turned it slightly toward me, I was struck by the intensity of his look. Then I understood that we had serious business in hand, and my first conjecture was that we had jumped a grizzly. I advanced to Morgan's side, cocking my piece as I moved. The bushes were now quiet and the sounds had ceased, but Morgan was as attentive to the place as before. "What is it? What the devil is it?" I asked. "That damned thing," he replied, without turning his head. His voice was husky and unnatural. He trembled visibly. I was about to speak further, when I observed the wild oats near the place of the disturbance moving in the most inexplicable way. I can hardly describe it. It seemed as if stirred by a streak of wind, which not only bent it, but pressed it down, crushed it so that it did not rise, and this movement was slowly prolonging itself directly toward us. Nothing that I had ever seen had affected me so strangely as this unfamiliar and unaccountable phenomenon, yet I am unable to recall any sense of fear. I remember and tell it here because, singularly enough, I recollected it then that once in looking carelessly out of an open window I momentarily mistook a small tree close at hand for one of a group of larger trees at a little distance away. It looked the same size as the others, but being more distinctly and sharply defined in mass and detail seemed out of harmony with them. It was a mere falsification of the law of aerial perspective, but it startled, almost terrified me. We so rely upon the orderly operation of familiar natural laws that any seeming suspension of them is noted as a menace to our safety, a warning of unthinkable calamity. So now the apparently causeless movement of the herbage and the slow, undeviating approach of the line of disturbance were distinctly disquieting. My companion appeared actually frightened, and I could hardly credit my senses when I saw him suddenly throw his gun to his shoulder and fire both barrels at the agitated grain. Before the smoke of the discharge had cleared away, I heard a loud savage cry, a scream like that of a wild animal, and flinging his gun upon the ground, Morgan sprang away and ran swiftly from the spot. At the same instant I was thrown violently to the ground by the impact of something unseen in the smoke, some soft, heavy substance that seemed thrown against me with great force. Before I could get upon my feet and recover my gun, which seemed to have been struck from my hands, I heard Morgan crying out as if in mortal agony, and mingling with his cries were such hoarse, savage sounds as one hears from fighting dogs. Inexpressibly terrified, I struggled to my feet and looked in the direction of Morgan's retreat, and may heaven in mercy spare me from another sight like that. At a distance of less than 30 yards was my friend, down upon one knee, his head thrown back at a frightful angle, hatless, his long hair in disorder and his whole body in violent movement from side to side, backward and forward. His right arm was lifted and seemed to lack the hand at least, I could see none. The other arm was invisible. At times, as my memory now reports this extraordinary scene, I could discern but a part of his body. It was as if he had been partly blotted out. I cannot otherwise express it than a shifting of his position would bring it all into view again. All this must have occurred within a few seconds, yet in that time Morgan assumed all the postures of a determined wrestler vanquished by superior weight and strength. I saw nothing but him, and him not always distinctly. During the entire incident his shouts and curses were heard, as if through an enveloping uproar of such sounds of rage and fury as I had never heard from the throat of man or brute. For a moment only I stood irresolute, then throwing down my gun I ran forward to my friend's assistance. I had a vague belief that he was suffering from a fit, or some form of convulsion. Before I could reach his side he was down and quiet. All sounds had ceased, but with a feeling of such terror as even these awful events had not inspired I now saw again the mysterious movement of the wild oats, prolonging itself from the trampled area about the prostrate man toward the edge of a wood. It was only when it had reached the wood that I was able to withdraw my eyes and look at my companion. He was dead. Ill Harker flushed crimson again, but said nothing, and the 7 jurors rose and solemnly filed out of the cabin. "If you have done insulting me, sir," said Harker, as soon as he and the officer were left alone with the dead man, "I suppose I am at liberty to go." "Yes." Harker started to leave, but paused, with his hand on the door latch. The habit of his profession was strong in him, stronger than his sense of personal dignity. He turned about and said, "The book that you have there, I recognize it as Morgan's diary. You seemed greatly interested in it. You read in it while I was testifying. May I see it?" "The public would like the book. Will cut no figure in this matter," replied the official, slipping it into his coat pocket. "All the entries in it were made before the writer's death." As Harker passed out of the house the jury re-entered and stood about the table, on which the now covered corpse showed under the sheet with sharp definition. The foreman seated himself near the candle, produced from his breast pocket a pencil and scrap of paper and wrote rather laboriously the following verdict, which with various degrees of effort all signed: "We, the jury, do find that the remains come to their death at the hands of a mountain lion, but some of us thinks, all the same, they had fits." For an explanation from the tomb in the diary of the late Hugh Morgan are certain interesting entries having, possibly, a scientific value as suggestions. At the inquest upon his body the book was not put in evidence. Possibly the coroner thought it not worthwhile to confuse the jury. The date of the first of the entries mentioned cannot be ascertained. The upper part of the leaf is torn away, the part of the entry Remaining follows, would run in a half circle, keeping his head turned always toward the center, and again he would stand still, barking furiously. At last he ran away into the brush as fast as he could go. I thought at first that he had gone mad, but on returning to the house found no other alteration in his manner than what was obviously due to fear of punishment. Can a dog see with his nose? Do odors impress some cerebral center with images of the thing that emitted them? Sept 2. Looking at the stars last night as they rose above the crest of the ridge east of the house, I observed them successively disappear from left to right. Each was eclipsed but an instant, and only a few at the same time, but along the entire length of the ridge all that were within a degree or two of the crest were blotted out. It was as if something had passed along between me and them, but I could not see it, and the stars were not thick enough to define its outline. Ugh. I don't like this. Several weeks' entries are missing, 3 leaves being torn from the book. Sept 27. It has been about here again. I find evidences of its presence every day. I watched again all last night in the same cover, gun in hand, double charged with buckshot. In the morning the fresh footprints were there, as before. Yet I would have sworn that I did not sleep. Indeed, I hardly sleep at all. It is terrible, insupportable. If these amazing experiences are real I shall go mad, if they are fanciful I am mad already. October 3rd. I shall not go, it shall not drive me away. No, this is my house, my land. God hates a coward. October 5th. I can stand it no longer, I have invited Harker to pass a few weeks with me. He has a level head. I can judge from his manner if he thinks me mad. Oct. 7. I have the solution of the mystery. It came to me last night suddenly, as by revelation. How simple, how terribly simple. There are sounds that we cannot hear. At either end of the scale are notes that stir no chord of that imperfect instrument, the human ear. They are too high or too grave. I observed a flock of blackbirds occupying an entire treetop, the tops of several trees, and all in full song. Suddenly, in a moment, at absolutely the same instant, all spring into the air and fly away. How? They could not all see one another. Whole treetops intervened. At no point could a leader have been visible to all. There must have been a signal of warning or command, high and shrill above the din, but by me unheard. I have observed, too, the same simultaneous flight when all were silent, among not only blackbirds, but other birds, quail, for example, widely separated by bushes even on opposite sides of a hill. It is known to seamen that a school of whales basking or sporting on the surface of the ocean, miles apart, with the convexity of the earth between, will sometimes dive at the same instant, all gone out of sight in a moment. The signal has been sounded too grave for the ear of the sailor at the masthead and his comrades on the deck, who nevertheless feel its vibrations in the ship as the stones of a cathedral are stirred by the bass of the organ. As with sounds, so with colors. At each end of the solar spectrum the chemist can detect the presence of what are known as actinic rays. They represent colors, integral colors in the composition of light, which we are unable to discern. The human eye is an imperfect instrument, its range is but a few octaves of the real, chromatic scale. I am not mad, there are colors that we cannot see. And, God help me, the damned thing is of such a color. One of the missing, Jerome Searing, a private soldier of General Sherman's army, then confronting the enemy at and about Kennesaw Mountain, Georgia, turned his back upon a small group of officers with whom he had been talking in low tones, stepped across a light line of earthworks, and disappeared in a forest. None of the men in line behind the works had said a word to him, nor had he so much as nodded to them in passing, but all who saw understood that this brave man had been entrusted with some perilous duty. Jerome Searing, though a private, did not serve in the ranks. He was detailed for service at division headquarters, being borne upon the rolls as an orderly. Orderly is a word covering a multitude of duties. An orderly may be a messenger, a clerk, an officer's servant, anything. He may perform services for which no provision is made in orders and army regulations. Their nature may depend upon his aptitude, upon favor, upon accident. Private Searing, an incomparable marksman, young, hardy, intelligent and insensible to fear, was a scout. The general commanding his division was not content to obey orders blindly without knowing what was in his front, even when his command was not on detached service, but formed a fraction of the line of the army, nor was he satisfied to receive his knowledge of his vis-a-vis through the customary channels. He wanted to know more than he was apprised of by the corps commander and the collisions of pickets and skirmishers. Hence Jerome Searing, with his extraordinary daring, his woodcraft, his sharp eyes, and truthful tongue. On this occasion his instructions were simple: to get as near the enemy's lines as possible and learn all that he could. In a few moments he had arrived at the picket line, the men on duty there lying in groups of 2 and 4 behind little banks of earth scooped out of the slight depression in which they lay, their rifles protruding from the green boughs with which they had masked their small defenses. The forest extended without a break toward the front, so solemn and silent that only by an effort of the imagination could it be conceived as populous with armed men, alert and vigilant, a forest formidable with possibilities of battle. Pausing a moment in one of these rifle pits to apprise the men of his intention, Searing crept stealthily forward on his hands and knees and was soon lost to view in a dense thicket of underbrush. "That is the last of him," said one of the men. "I wish I had his rifle. Those fellows will hurt some of us with it." Searing crept on, taking advantage of every accident of ground and growth to give himself better cover. His eyes penetrated everywhere, his ears took note of every sound. He stilled his breathing, and at the cracking of a twig beneath his knee stopped his progress and hugged the earth. It was slow work, but not tedious. The danger made it exciting, but by no physical signs was the excitement manifest. His pulse was as regular, his nerves were as steady as if he were trying to trap a sparrow. "It seems a long time," he thought, "but I cannot have come very far. I am still alive." He smiled at his own method of estimating distance, and crept forward. A moment later he suddenly flattened himself upon the earth and lay motionless, minute after minute. Through a narrow opening in the bushes he had caught sight of a small mound of yellow clay, one of the enemy's rifle pits. After some little time he cautiously raised his head, inch by inch, then his body upon his hands, spread out on each side of him, all the while intently regarding the hillock of clay. In another moment he was upon his feet, rifle in hand, striding rapidly forward with little attempt at concealment. He had rightly interpreted the signs. Whatever they were, the enemy was gone. To assure himself beyond a doubt before going back to report upon so important a matter, Searing pushed forward across the line of abandoned pits, running from cover to cover in the more open forest, his eyes vigilant to discover possible stragglers. He came to the edge of a plantation, one of those forlorn, deserted homesteads of the last years of the war, upgrown with brambles, ugly with broken fences and desolate with vacant buildings having blank apertures in place of doors and windows. After a keen reconnaissance from the safe seclusion of a clump of young pines, Searing ran lightly across a field and through an orchard to a small structure which stood apart from the other farm buildings, on a slight elevation. This he thought would enable him to overlook a large scope of country in the direction that he supposed the enemy to have taken in withdrawing. This building, which had originally consisted of a single room elevated upon 4 posts about 10 feet high, was now little more than a roof. The floor had fallen away, the joists and planks loosely piled on the ground below or resting on end at various angles, not wholly torn from their fastenings above. The supporting posts were themselves no longer vertical. It looked as if the whole edifice would go down at the touch of a finger. Concealing himself in the debris of joists and flooring, Searing looked across the open ground between his point of view and a spur of Kennesaw Mountain, a half-mile away. A road leading up and across this spur was crowded with troops, the rear guard of the retiring enemy, their gun barrels gleaming in the morning sunlight. Searing had now learned all that he could hope to know. It was his duty to return to his own command with all possible speed and report his discovery. But the gray column of Confederates toiling up the mountain road was singularly tempting. His rifle, an ordinary Springfield, but fitted with a globe sight and hair trigger, would easily send its ounce and a quarter of lead hissing into their midst. That would probably not affect the duration and result of the war, but it is the business of a soldier to kill. It is also his habit if he is a good soldier. Searing cocked his rifle and set the trigger. But it was decreed from the beginning of time that Private Searing was not to murder anybody that bright summer morning, nor was the Confederate retreat to be announced by him. For countless ages events had been so matching themselves together in that wondrous mosaic, to some parts of which, dimly discernible, we give the name of history, that the acts which he had in will would have marred the harmony of the pattern. Some 25 years previously the power charged with the execution of the work according to the design had provided against that mischance by causing the birth of a certain male child in a little village at the foot of the Carpathian Mountains, had carefully reared it, supervised its education, directed its desires into a military channel, and in due time made it an officer of artillery. by the concurrence of an infinite number of favoring influences and their preponderance over an infinite number of opposing ones, this officer of artillery had been made to commit a breach of discipline and flee from his native country to avoid punishment. He had been directed to New Orleans, instead of New York, where a recruiting officer awaited him on the wharf. He was enlisted and promoted, and things were so ordered that he now commanded a Confederate battery some 2 miles along the line from where Jerome Searing, the Federal scout, stood cocking his rifle. Nothing had been neglected at every step in the progress of both these men's lives, and in the lives of their contemporaries and ancestors, and in the lives of the contemporaries of their ancestors. The right thing had been done to bring about the desired result. Had anything in all this vast concatenation been overlooked, Private Searing might have fired on the retreating Confederates that morning, and would perhaps have missed. As it fell out, a Confederate captain of artillery, having nothing better to do while awaiting his turn to pull out and be off, amused himself by sighting a field piece obliquely to his right at what he mistook for some Federal officers on the crest of a hill, and discharged it. The shot flew high of its mark. As Jerome Searing drew back the hammer of his rifle and with his eyes upon the distant Confederates considered where he could plant his shot with the best hope of making a widow or an orphan or a childless mother, perhaps all three, for Private Searing, although he had repeatedly refused promotion, was not without a certain kind of ambition. He heard a rushing sound in the air, like that made by the wings of a great bird swooping down upon its prey. More quickly than he could apprehend the gradation, it increased to a hoarse and horrible roar, as the missile that made it sprang at him out of the sky, striking with a deafening impact one of the posts supporting the confusion of timbers above him, smashing it into matchwood, and bringing down the crazy edifice with a loud clatter, in clouds of blinding dust. When Jerome Searing recovered consciousness, he did not at once understand what had occurred. It was, indeed, some time before he opened his eyes. For a while he believed that he had died and been buried, and he tried to recall some portions of the burial service. He thought that his wife was kneeling upon his grave, adding her weight to that of the earth upon his breast. The two of them, widow and earth, had crushed his coffin. Unless the children should persuade her to go home, he would not much longer be able to breathe. He felt a sense of wrong. I cannot speak to her, he thought. The dead have no voice, and if I open my eyes I shall get them full of earth. He opened his eyes. A great expanse of blue sky, rising from a fringe of the tops of trees. In the foreground, shutting out some of the trees, a high, dun mound, angular in outline and crossed by an intricate, patternless system of straight lines, the whole an immeasurable distance away, a distance so inconceivably great that it fatigued him, and he closed his eyes. The moment that he did so he was conscious of an insufferable light. A sound was in his ears like the low, rhythmic thunder of a distant sea breaking in successive waves upon the beach, and out of this noise, seeming a part of it, or possibly coming from beyond it, and intermingled with its ceaseless undertone, came the articulate words, "Jerome Searing, you are caught like a rat in a trap, in a trap, trap, trap." Suddenly there fell a great silence, a black darkness, an infinite tranquility, and Jerome Searing, perfectly conscious of his rathood, and well assured of the trap that he was in, remembering all and nowise alarmed, again opened his eyes to reconnoitre, to note the strength of his enemy, to plan his defense. He was caught in a reclining posture, his back firmly supported by a solid beam. Another lay across his breast, but he had been able to shrink a little away from it so that it no longer oppressed him, though it was immovable. A brace joining it at an angle had wedged him against a pile of boards on his left, fastening the arm on that side. His legs, slightly parted, and straight along the ground, were covered upward to the knees with a mass of debris which towered above his narrow horizon. His head was as rigidly fixed as in a vice, he could move his eyes, his chin no more. Only his right arm was partly free. "You must help us out of this," he said to it. But he could not get it from under the heavy timber athwart his chest, nor move it outward more than 6 inches at the elbow. Searing was not seriously injured, nor did he suffer pain. A smart rap on the head from a flying fragment of the splintered post, incurred simultaneously with the frightfully sudden shock to the nervous system, had momentarily dazed him. His term of unconsciousness, including the period of recovery, during which he had had the strange fancies, had probably not exceeded a few seconds, for the dust of the wreck had not wholly cleared away as he began an intelligent survey of the situation. With his partly free right hand he now tried to get hold of the beam that lay across, but not quite against, his breast. In no way could he do so. He was unable to depress the shoulder so as to push the elbow beyond that edge of the timber which was nearest his knees. Failing in that, he could not raise the forearm and hand to grasp the beam. The brace that made an angle with it downward and backward prevented him from doing anything in that direction, and between it and his body the space was not half so wide as the length of his forearm. Obviously he could not get his hand under the beam nor over it. The hand could not, in fact, touch it at all. Having demonstrated his inability, he desisted, and began to think whether he could reach any of the debris piled upon his legs. In surveying the mass with a view to determining that point, his attention was arrested by what seemed to be a ring of shining metal immediately in front of his eyes. It appeared to him at first to surround some perfectly black substance, and it was somewhat more than a half-inch in diameter. It suddenly occurred to his mind that the blackness was simply shadow and that the ring was in fact the muzzle of his rifle protruding from the pile of debris. He was not long in satisfying himself that this was so if it was a satisfaction. By closing either eye he could look a little way along the barrel to the point where it was hidden by the rubbish that held it. He could see the one side, with the corresponding eye, at apparently the same angle as the other side with the other eye. Looking with the right eye, the weapon seemed to be directed at a point to the left of his head, and vice versa. He was unable to see the upper surface of the barrel, but could see the undersurface of the stock at a slight angle. The piece was, in fact, aimed at the exact center of his forehead. In the perception of this circumstance, in the recollection that just previously to the mischance of which this uncomfortable situation was the result, he had cocked the rifle and set the trigger so that a touch would discharge it. Private Searing was affected with a feeling of uneasiness. But that was as far as possible from fear. He was a brave man, somewhat familiar with the aspect of rifles from that point of view, and of cannon too. And now he recalled, with something like amusement, an incident of his experience at the storming of Missionary Ridge, where, walking up to one of the enemy's embrasures from which he had seen a heavy gun throw charge after charge of grape among the assailants, he had thought for a moment that the piece had been withdrawn. He could see nothing in the opening but a brazen circle. What that was he had understood just in time to step aside as it pitched another peck of iron down that swarming slope. To face firearms is one of the commonest incidents in a soldier's life. Firearms, too, with malevolent eyes blazing behind them. That is what a soldier is for. Still, Private Searing did not altogether relish the situation, and turned away his eyes. After groping, aimless, with his right hand for a time he made an ineffectual attempt to release his left. Then he tried to disengage his head, the fixity of which was the more annoying from his ignorance of what held it. Next he tried to free his feet, but while exerting the powerful muscles of his legs for that purpose it occurred to him that a disturbance of the rubbish which held them might discharge the rifle. How it could have endured what had already befallen it he could not understand, although memory assisted him with several instances in point. One in particular he recalled, in which in a moment of mental abstraction he had clubbed his rifle and beaten out another gentleman's brains, observing afterward that the weapon which he had been diligently swinging by the muzzle was loaded, capped, and at full cock, knowledge of which circumstance would doubtless have cheered his antagonist to longer endurance. He had always smiled in recalling that blunder of his green and salad days as a soldier, but now he did not smile. He turned his eyes again to the muzzle of the rifle and for a moment fancied that it had moved. It seemed somewhat nearer. Again he looked away. The tops of the distant trees beyond the bounds of the plantation interested him. He had not before observed how light and feathery they were, nor how darkly blue the sky was, even among their branches, where they somewhat paled it with their green. Above him it appeared almost black. It will be uncomfortably hot here, he thought, as the day advances. I wonder which way I am looking. Judging by such shadows as he could see, he decided that his face was due north. He would at least not have the sun in his eyes, and north, well, that was toward his wife and children. Bah, he exclaimed aloud, what have they to do with it? He closed his eyes. As I can't get out I may as well go to sleep. The rebels are gone and some of our fellows are sure to stray out here foraging. They'll find me. But he did not sleep. Gradually he became sensible of a pain in his forehead, a dull ache, hardly perceptible at first, but growing more and more uncomfortable. He opened his eyes and it was gone, closed them and it returned. The devil, he said, irrelevantly, and stared again at the sky. He heard the singing of birds, the strange metallic note of the meadow lark, suggesting the clash of vibrant blades. He fell into pleasant memories of his childhood, played again with his brother and sister, raced across the fields, shouting to alarm the sedentary larks, entered the somber forest beyond and with timid steps followed the faint path to Ghost Rock, standing at last with audible heart-throbs before the dead man's cave and seeking to penetrate its awful mystery. For the first time he observed that the opening of the haunted cavern was encircled by a ring of metal. Then all else vanished and left him gazing into the barrel of his rifle as before. But whereas before it had seemed nearer, it now seemed an inconceivable distance away, and all the more sinister for that. He cried out and, startled by something in his own voice, the note of fear lied to himself in denial, "If I don't sing out I may stay here till I die." He now made no further attempt to evade the menacing stare of the gun barrel. If he turned away his eyes an instant it was to look for assistance, although he could not see the ground on either side the ruin, and he permitted them to return, obedient to the imperative. Fascination. If he closed them it was from weariness, and instantly the poignant pain in his forehead, the prophecy and menace of the bullet forced him to reopen them. The tension of nerve and brain was too severe. Nature came to his relief with intervals of unconsciousness. Reviving from one of these he became sensible of a sharp, smarting pain in his right hand, and when he worked his fingers together, or rubbed his palm with them, he could feel that they were wet and slippery. He could not see the hand, but he knew the sensation, it was running blood. In his delirium he had beaten it against the jagged fragments of the wreck, had clutched it full of splinters. He resolved that he would meet his fate more manly. He was a plain, common soldier, had no religion and not much philosophy. He could not die like a hero, with great and wise last words, even if there had been someone to hear them, but he could die game, and he would. But if he could only know when to expect the shot. Some rats which had probably inhabited the shed came sneaking and scampering about. One of them mounted the pile of debris that held the rifle, another followed in another. Searing regarded them at first with indifference, then with friendly interest, then, as the thought flashed into his bewildered mind that they might touch the trigger of his rifle, he cursed them and ordered them to go away. "It is no business of yours," he cried. The creatures went away. They would return later, attack his face, gnaw away his nose, cut his throat, he knew that, but he hoped by that time to be dead. Nothing could now unfix his gaze from the little ring of metal with its black interior. The pain in his forehead was fierce and incessant. He felt it gradually penetrating the brain more and more deeply, until at last its progress was arrested by the wood at the back of his head. It grew momentarily more insufferable. He began wantonly beating his lacerated hand against the splinters again to counteract that horrible ache. It seemed to throb with a slow, regular recurrence, each pulsation sharper than the preceding, and sometimes he cried out, thinking he felt the fatal bullet. No thoughts of home, of wife, and children, of country, of glory. The whole record of memory was effaced. The world had passed away, not a vestige remained. Here in this confusion of timbers and boards is the sole universe. Here is immortality in time, each pain an everlasting life. The throbs tick off eternities. Jerome Searing, the man of courage, the formidable enemy, the strong, resolute warrior, was as pale as a ghost. His jaw was fallen, his eyes protruded, he trembled in every fiber, a cold sweat bathed his entire body, he screamed with fear. He was not insane, he was terrified. In groping about with his torn and bleeding hand he seized at last a strip of board, and, pulling, felt it give way. It lay parallel with his body, and by bending his elbow as much as the contracted space would permit, he could draw it a few inches at a time. Finally it was altogether loosened from the wreckage covering his legs, he could lift it clear of the ground its whole length. A great hope came into his mind, perhaps he could work it upward, that is to say backward, far enough to lift the end and push aside the rifle, or, if that were too tightly wedged, so place the strip of board as to deflect the bullet. With this object he passed it backward inch by inch, hardly daring to breathe lest that act somehow defeat his intent, and more than ever unable to remove his eyes from the rifle, which might perhaps now hasten to improve its waning opportunity. Something at least had been gained. In the occupation of his mind in this attempt at self-defense he was less sensible of the pain in his head and had ceased to wince. But he was still dreadfully frightened and his teeth rattled like castanets. The strip of board ceased to move to the suasion of his hand. He tugged at it with all his strength, changed the direction of its length all he could, but it had met some extended obstruction behind him and the end in front was still too far away to clear the pile of debris and reach the muzzle of the gun. It extended, indeed, nearly as far as the trigger guard, which, uncovered by the rubbish, he could imperfectly see with his right eye. He tried to break the strip with his hand, but had no leverage. In his defeat, all his terror returned, augmented tenfold. The black aperture of the rifle appeared to threaten a sharper and more imminent death in punishment of his rebellion. The track of the bullet through his head ached with an intenser anguish. He began to tremble again. Suddenly he became composed. His tremor subsided. He clenched his teeth and drew down his eyebrows. He had not exhausted his means of defense. A new design had shaped itself in his mind, another plan of battle. Raising the front end of the strip of board, he carefully pushed it forward through the wreckage at the side of the rifle until it pressed against the trigger guard. Then he moved the end slowly outward until he could feel that it had cleared it, then, closing his eyes, thrust it against the trigger with all his strength. There was no explosion. The rifle had been discharged as it dropped from his hand when the building fell. But it did its work. Lieutenant Adrian Searing, in command of the picket guard on that part of the line through which his brother Jerome had passed on his mission, sat with attentive ears in his brazed work behind the line. Not the faintest sound escaped him, the cry of a bird, the barking of a squirrel, the noise of the wind among the pines, all were anxiously noted by his overstrained sense. Suddenly, directly in front of his line, he heard a faint, confused rumble, like the clatter of a falling building translated by distance. The lieutenant mechanically looked at his watch. 6 o'clock and 18 minutes. At the same moment an officer approached him on foot from the rear and saluted. "Lieutenant," said the officer, "the colonel directs you to move forward your line and feel the enemy if you find him. If not, continue the advance until directed to halt. There is reason to think that the enemy has retreated." The lieutenant nodded and said nothing. The other officer retired. In a moment the men, apprised of their duty by the non-commissioned officers in low tones, had deployed from their rifle pits and were moving forward in skirmishing order, with set teeth and beating hearts. This line of skirmishers sweeps across the plantation toward the mountain. They pass on both sides of the wrecked building, observing nothing. At a short distance, in their rear their commander comes. He casts his eyes curiously upon the ruin and sees a dead body half buried in boards and timbers. It is so covered with dust that its clothing is Confederate gray. Its face is yellowish white, the cheeks are fallen in, the temples sunken, too, with sharp ridges about them, making the forehead forbiddingly narrow. The upper lip, slightly lifted, shows the white teeth, rigidly clenched. The hair is heavy with moisture, the face as wet as the dewy grass all about. From his point of view the officer does not observe the rifle. The man was apparently killed by the fall of the building. "Dead a week," said the officer curtly, moving on and absently pulling out his watch as if to verify his estimate of time. 6 o'clock and 40 minutes. The stranger, a man, stepped out of the darkness into the little illuminated circle about our failing campfire and seated himself upon a rock. "You are not the first to explore this region," he said, gravely. Nobody contradicted his statement. He was himself proof of its truth, for he was not of our party and must have been somewhere near when we camped. Moreover, he must have companions not far away. It was not a place where one would be living or traveling alone. For more than a week we had seen, besides ourselves and our animals, only such living things as rattlesnakes and horned toads. In an Arizona desert one does not long coexist with only such creatures as these. One must have pack animals, supplies, arms and outfit. And all these imply comrades. It was perhaps a doubt as to what manner of men this unceremonious stranger's comrades might be, together with something in his words interpretable as a challenge, that caused every man of our half-dozen gentlemen adventurers to rise to a sitting posture and lay his hand upon a weapon, an act signifying, in that time and place, a policy of expectation. The stranger gave the matter no attention and began again to speak in the same deliberate, uninfected monotone in which he had delivered his first sentence. 30 years ago Ramon Gallegos, William Shaw, George W. Kent and Barry Davis, all of Tucson, crossed the Santa Catalina Mountains and traveled due west, as nearly as the configuration of the country permitted. We were prospecting and it was our intention, if we found nothing, to push through to the Gila River at some point near Big Bend, where we understood there was a settlement. We had a good outfit but no guide, just Ramon Gallegos, William Shaw, Geoxga W. Kent and Barry Davis. The man repeated the names slowly and distinctly, as if to fix them in the memories of his audience, every member of which was now attentively observing him, but with a slackened apprehension regarding his possible companions somewhere in the darkness that seemed to enclose us like a black wall. In the manner of this volunteer historian was no suggestion of an unfriendly purpose. His act was rather that of a harmless lunatic than an enemy. We were not so new to the country as not to know that the solitary life of many a plainsman had a tendency to develop eccentricities of conduct and character not always easily distinguishable from mental aberration. A man is like a tree. In a forest of his fellows he will grow as straight as his generic end. Individual nature permits, alone in the open, he yields to the deforming stresses and torsions that environ him. Some such thoughts were in my mind as I watched the man from the shadow of my head, pulled low to shut out the firelight. A witless fellow, no doubt, but what could he be doing there in the heart of a desert? Having undertaken to tell this story, I wish that I could describe the man's appearance. That would be a natural thing to do. Unfortunately, and somewhat strangely, I find myself unable to do so with any degree of confidence, for afterward no two of us agreed as to what he wore and how he looked, and when I try to set down my own impressions they elude me. Anyone can tell some kind of story, narration is one of the elemental powers of the race. But the talent for description is a gift. Nobody having broken silence, the visitor went on to say, this country was not then what it is now. There was not a ranch between the Gila and the Gulf. There was a little game here and there in the mountains, and near the infrequent waterholes grass enough to keep our animals from starvation. If we should be so fortunate as to encounter no Indians we might get through. But within a week the purpose of the expedition had altered from discovery of wealth to preservation of life. We had gone too far to go back, for what was ahead could be no worse than what was behind, so we pushed on, riding by night to avoid Indians and the intolerable heat, and concealing ourselves by day as best we could. Sometimes, having exhausted our supply of wild meat and emptied our casks, we were days without food or drink. Then a waterhole or a shallow pool in the bottom of an arroyo so restored our strength and sanity that we were able to shoot some of the wild animals that sought it also. Sometimes it was a bear, sometimes an antelope, a coyote, a cougar that was as God pleased, all were food. One morning as we skirted a mountain range, seeking a practicable pass, we were attacked by a band of Apaches who had followed our trail up a gulch. It is not far from here. Knowing that they outnumbered us 10 to 1, they took none of their usual cowardly precautions, but dashed upon us at a gallop, firing and yelling. Fighting was out of the question. We urged our feeble animals up the gulch as far as there was footing for a hoof, then threw ourselves out of our saddles and took to the chaparral on one of the slopes, abandoning our entire outfit to the enemy. But we retained our rifles, every man. Ramon Gallegos, William Shaw, George W. Kent and Barry Davis. Same old crowd, said the humorist of our party. He was an Eastern man, unfamiliar with the decent observances of social intercourse. A gesture of disapproval from our leader silenced him, and the stranger proceeded with his tale. The savages dismounted also, and some of them ran up the gulch beyond the point at which we had left it, cutting off further retreat in that direction and forcing us on up the side. Unfortunately the chaparral extended only a short distance up the slope, and as we came into the open ground above we took the fire of a dozen rifles, but Apaches shoot badly when in a hurry, and God so willed it that none of us fell. 20 yards up the slope, beyond the edge of the brush, were vertical cliffs, in which, directly in front of us, was a narrow opening. Into that we ran, finding ourselves in a cavern about as large as an ordinary room in a house. Here for a time we were safe. A single man with a repeating rifle could defend the entrance against all the Apaches in the land. But against hunger and thirst we had no defense. Courage we still had, but hope was a memory. Not one of those Indians did we afterward see, but by the smoke and glare of their fires in the gulch we knew that by day and by night they watched with ready rifles in the edge of the bush, knew that if we made a sortie not a man of us would live to take 3 steps into the open. For 3 days, watching in turn, we held out before our suffering became insupportable. Then it was the morning of the 4th day. Ramon Gallegos said, "Señors, I know not well of the good God and what please him. I have lived without religion, and I am not acquainted with that of you. Pardon, seigneurs, if I shock you, but for me the time has come to beat the game of the Apache. He knelt upon the rock floor of the cave and pressed his pistol against his temple. Madre de Dios, he said, comes now the soul of Ramon Gallegos. And so he left us William Shaw, George W. Kent and Barry Davis. I was the leader, it was for me to speak. He was a brave man, I said he knew when to die, and how. It is foolish to go mad from thirst and fall by Apache bullets, or be skinned alive, it is in bad taste. Let us join Ramon Gallegos. That is right, said William Shaw. That is right, said George W. Kent. I straightened the limbs of Ramon Gallegos and put a handkerchief over his face. Then William Shaw said, I should like to look like that a little while. And George W. Kent said that he felt that way, too. It shall be so, I said, the Red Devils will wait a week. William Shaw and George W. Kent, draw and kneel. They did so and I stood before them. Almighty God, our Father, said I. Almighty God, our Father, said William Shaw. Almighty God, our Father, said George W. Kent. Forgive us our sins, said I. Forgive us our sins, said they. And receive our souls. And receive our souls. Amen. Amen. I laid them beside Ramon Gallegos and covered their faces. There was a quick commotion on the opposite side of the campfire. One of our party had sprung to his feet, pistol in hand. And you, he shouted, you dared to escape? You dare to be alive? You cowardly hound, I'll send you to join them if I hang for it. But with the leap of a panther the captain was upon him, grasping his wrist. Hold it in, Sam Yunsei, hold it in. We were now all upon our feet except the stranger, who sat motionless and apparently inattentive. Someone seized Yunsei's other arm. Captain, I said, there is something wrong here. This fellow is either a lunatic or merely a liar, just a plain, everyday liar whom Yunsei has no call to kill. If this man was of that party, it had 5 members, one of whom probably himself he has not named. Yes, said the captain, releasing the insurgent, who sat down, there is something unusual. Years ago 4 dead bodies of white men, scalped and shamefully mutilated, were found about the mouth of that cave. They are buried there, I have seen the graves, we shall all see them tomorrow. The stranger rose, standing tall in the light of the expiring fire, which in our breathless attention to his story we had neglected to keep going. There were 4, he said, Ramon Gallegos, William Shaw, George W. Kent and Barry Davis. With this reiterated roll call of the dead he walked into the darkness and we saw him no more. At that moment one of our party, who had been on guard, strode in among us, rifle in hand and somewhat excited. Captain, he said, for the last half hour 3 men have been standing out there on the mesa. He pointed in the direction taken by the stranger. I could see them distinctly, for the moon is up, but as they had no guns and I had them covered with mine I thought it was their move. They have made none, but, damn it, they have got onto my nerves. Go back to your post, and stay till you see them again, said the captain. The rest of you lie down again, or I'll kick you all into the fire. The sentinel obediently withdrew, swearing, and did not return. As we were arranging our blankets the fiery Yunsei said, I beg your pardon, Captain, but who the devil do you take them to be? Ramon Gallegos, William Shaw, and George W. Kent. But how about Barry Davis? I ought to have shot him. Quite needless, you couldn't have made him any deader. Go to sleep. Read more in Penguin. For complete information about books available from Penguin and how to order them, please write to us at the appropriate address below. Please note that for copyright reasons the selection of books varies from country to country. In the United Kingdom, please write to Department EP, Penguin Books Ltd, Bath Road, Harmondsworth, Middlesex Ubeota. In the United States, please write to Consumer Sales, Penguin USA, P.O. Box 999 Department 17109, Bergenfield, New Jersey, 07621-0120. Visa and MasterCard holders call 1-800-253-6476 to order Penguin titles. In Canada, please write to Penguin Books Canada Ltd, 10, Alcorn Avenue Suite 300 Toronto, Ontario M4V3B2. In Australia, please write to Penguin Books Australia Ltd, P.O. Box 257, Ringwood, Victoria 3134. In New Zealand, please write to Penguin Books, NZ, Ltd, Private Bag 102902, North Shore Mail Centre, Auckland 10. In India, please write to Penguin Books India Pvt Ltd, 706 Eros Apartments, 56, Nehru Place New Delhi No 019. In the Netherlands, please write to Penguin Books Netherlands BV, Post Bus $3.07, NL 1001 I Amsterdam. In Germany, please write to Penguin Books Deutschland GmbH, Metzlerstrasse 26, 60594 Frankfurt am Main. In Spain, please write to Penguin Books SA, Bravo Murillo 19, I Degree B, 28015 Madrid. In Italy, please write to Penguin Italia S.R.L, via Felice Casati 20, 1 to 20124 Milano. In France, please write to Penguin France SA, 17 Rue Lejeune, F 31000 Toulouse. In Japan, please write to Penguin Books Japan, Ishikiri-bashi Building, 2-5-4, Suido, Bunkyoku, Tokyo 112. In Greece, please write to Penguin Hellas Ltd, Dimocrita 3, GR 10671 Athens. In South Africa, please write to Longman Penguin Southern Africa, Thai, Ltd, Private Bag X08, Birdsham 2013. Penguin 60s Classics and Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge and Other Stories. The famous tale of a condemned man stepping up to the gallows. Ambrose Bierce, 1842 c. 1914, was an American journalist, satirist, and short story writer, and a member of the Western literary circle that included Bret Harte and Mark Twain. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, his best-known story, and 5 others, Beyond the Wall, An Adventure at Brownville, The Demmed Thing, One of the Missing, and The Stranger Display. His particular genius for crafting gripping tales of mystery, horror, and suspense. The cover shows an illustration by John Capel. Copyright Penguin Can. $1.49 U.S. $1.95 ISBN 0-14-600204-090,009, 780146002045.